You're listening to Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. Today I'm talking with Dr. T. Christopher Aplin. Dr. Aplin earned his PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of California in Los Angeles. His recent publications include a 3-part series of articles on indigenous North American hip-hop, addressing Afro-Indian histories, Christianity, and the cosmopolitanism of indigenous peoples, both past and present. He's currently working with the Fort Sill Apache Tribe to secure grant funding to preserve their recorded cultural heritage, including instantaneous discs, reel-to-reels, and cassettes for future generations. He's also writing a book about the music of the Apache prisoners of war taken with Geronimo in 1886. He is also exploring other related research projects in the Los Angeles area that emphasize connections among music, violence, militarism, and imprisonment. Welcome, Chris, to Voces Críticas.
Good to be here.
As a scholar of music, indigenous history, and sound studies, how does music offer us critical insights into Native histories that we can actually only acquire through music?
To my knowledge, Native people have been recording their music, and they've been recording their conversations for a very long time. I have recordings, having done archival work with communities at the Library of Congress as well in the UCLA Ethnomusicology Archive. Having dealt with all these different layers of recordings, I know that in southwest Oklahoma, where I do a lot of my work, these recordings go back to at least mid-century. But in one of the tribal collections that I have, there's actually a mention of the fact that the tribe or tribal members actually used to have recorded cylinders. So if you're talking about recorded cylinders, those recordings would have dated between about 1900 and 1920. And I'm an ethnomusicologist, and ethnomusicology has its origins in the cylinder and in the ability to go and collect folk music. And Native people were among the groups that people targeted for doing that kind of research. But if Native people were recording all the way back in 1900 to 1920, it's almost horrifying for me to think about the loss that's probably occurred to many of those cylinders. But people have been recording within the community for a long time. And overall, I think there's a big potential within Native communities to recover a lot of history, a lot of oral traditions, and a lot of languages. And so it's this recorded sound medium, I think, that has made, at least for my work, but I think more generally, that makes it possible for us to recover.
So what are other methods or methodologies in the social sciences or in the humanities that you have found inadequate in effectively relaying and conveying Native histories?
One of the things I always get stuck on is the word tribe or tribalism. I think there are a lot of Native people who feel very proud of being a member of a tribe, and they should. It's part of their history, it's part of their heritage, but I feel like it's just a word that doesn't carry as much weight as it should sometimes. When I say that, I notice that when I read editorials in newspapers or when I hear the pundit class on broadcast television, CNN, MSNBC, or what have you, tribalism seems to be at the lips of a lot of people complaining about the polarization in American politics, for example. What they're kind of alluding to is a sense of smallness or a sense of primitiveness, which goes back to old anthropology. And tribes are a fact, and they've been around, and like I said, a lot of people have a lot of pride in them, but I feel like it underestimates the sophistication of the people who are the members of those tribes. I find myself sticking on that word quite a bit because it feels like an archaic evolutionary theory from way back in the early days of anthropology.
That is such a good point because that is on the lips of every single political commentary right now in any of the mainstream is like, we're resorting to tribalism. You know, their invocation of that, makes my skin crawl a little bit.
And it doesn't capture the lives that people lived.
Where did the inspiration for this book in progress come from about the music of the Apache prisoners of war taken with Geronimo in 1886? And why is this an important story to tell?
It came from the recorded sound collections of the Fort Sill Warm Springs Apache Tribe that I work with. They have a remarkable collection of audio recordings of ceremonials and songs of Apache language and history. And so really the book came from that. I've actually been working with this tribe for a period of about 20 years or so. Truthfully, I first experienced their ceremonial, it's called the fire dance, about 20 years ago, and I started working with them formally probably about 18 years. And so I've worked with them continuously, talking about music, talking about ceremony, talking about life, talking about punk rock, talking about like a lot of things, And over time, and this is even past the point where I finished my PhD, I never really asked too much about Geronimo because I never really had an interest so much in Geronimo. And to some degree, it also felt like the people that I worked with were not necessarily that engaged by that as a topic. I saw no real reason to pursue it. But over time, when you start digging into these sound collections and you start listening to these oral histories, a picture starts coming out. And it's a little tough because I always say my book's about the music of the Apache prisoners of war taken with Geronimo. In terms of speaking about Geronimo, he's a monolithic icon that you almost can't talk about Apaches without bringing up the name. But I guess overall, by listening to the music and learning what the songs are about, over time I kind of realized what I've always known, which is to say the Apaches are artists and they are musicians. They are people who have creative ideals and aspirations, who are connected to the people around them and who are funny, filled with life. And it's some of those stories I wanted to be able to tell over time. I guess I just found it surprising because anytime you open a history book, especially when you're dealing with Apaches, I'm looking at one, Western Apache raiding and warfare. It's not uncommon for them to always be stuck with this ideal of warfare, but what happens when you start talking about Apaches as artists and musicians? And so that's pretty much where the inspiration came from, was by listening to the songs and ceremonials, but also getting into their sound collections, talking to my friends, and getting to know more about how deep their artistic heritage is.
So tell us about the youth perspectives and experiences that you've come across through musical analysis that is being part of this book in progress.
Well, specifically with this book, and I'm still working it through with my colleagues at the tribe, we're kind of talking it through together and trying to discover some of the meaning in these recordings. I think it's important to kind of report history in a way that jibes with local knowledge, because the truth is they have a lot to say, and they are some powerful truths that they have to say. But speaking for myself, to some degree, what I'm doing is, instead of looking at the great men, which is to say that Apache histories, again, are often the product of the U.S. military perspectives on Apache warfare, or they're about the presumed great man Geronimo of the Apache people. He wasn't actually a chief in any way. But those are the two ways that people typically look at that history, by looking at the wartime leaders. Because there are oral histories available, I've realized that I can actually tell this history that people have written over and over and over again, instead of from the perspective of a high-level chief or military man, from the perspective of the youth who's experiencing Apache warfare, who's experiencing imprisonment in the Southeast, in Florida, Alabama, and Oklahoma. And you can kind of go through those oral histories and come to some understanding of what it meant to be wrongly imprisoned across a lifetime, but also the kind of effects that those experiences had on youths and the way that it's recorded in some of the songs that they sing. To me, the book is unique in that I get to work with the community, and by working with the community, you can open up a completely different layer for imagining what happened during the Apache Wars. And by looking at it from a perspective of youth, it brings up a very different sort of conclusion. And my big conclusion there is to take the spotlight off of Geronimo and to look at the Mangus Coloradus Confederation. Mangus is probably, for Apaches, one of the most respected leaders, and his power was far-reaching. By calling it a confederacy, I'm talking about like politically distinct bodies cooperatively working together. And once you're sort of talking at that level, you're talking about a very different thing than many of these histories that we've looked at, from the U.S. military perspective or from Geronimo's perspective. I need to take a whole book to kind of explain some of what that means, but I think it's pretty profound, and I think, truthfully, that a lot of Native communities have this kind of recorded heritage, and I think that if they were able to protect these collections and write it up themselves or collaboratively work with scholars, I think there are a huge number of things that can be accomplished to write better Native histories.
So as a sound archivist, what are some of the technical challenges to culturally preserving the community-based audio recordings that are part of your research?
Funding's one of them. Truth is, I think that there are American funding agencies that are very interested in funding Native projects, but compiling the materials, getting the application written up, and then getting the funding is one of the big challenges that we face. There's another bigger one operating in the background, because the University of Indiana, which has a very important digitization program, the United Nations, and the Council for Library Information Resources, they all say, basically, that for people who have cultural analog recordings, we really only have 10 to 15 years to get these materials digitized before obsolescence of cassette, reel, instantaneous disc, readback technologies makes it impossible to digitize these materials any further. We're also running out of people who are skilled enough at doing these processes. So, I mean, the truth is that's a rather large technical challenge to what we're dealing with. And then beyond that, you also have problems with technological infrastructure for preserving collections. And for tribes, getting tribe buy-in is very difficult because they are very concerned about the security of their cultural heritage. And being protective of that recorded sound heritage, which is probably one of the most important sort of items of cultural heritage that many communities still maintain, this recorded sound heritage is just what the tribes have. They're closely held objects with connection to the past, and they want the world to know about the historical value of their collections. But they are also very nervous about their ability to maintain control of its use and meaning, which often means that they limit its circulation within the community itself. There are a number of things that make this kind of work difficult, but given the funding agencies, I think, are very much on board with doing this work, I think there's an awful lot of good work that can be done for tribes and with tribes along these lines.
You are listening to Dr. T. Christopher Aplin, an independent scholar and ethnomusicologist who has published about indigenous North American hip-hop and is also currently writing a book about the music of the Apache prisoners of war taken with Geronimo in 1886. So clearly sounds are an important part of Native heritage, of indigenous history. In your scholarship about indigenous North American hip-hop, you use this term indigenous cosmopolitanism. What does this term mean in your work?
That's kind of my reaction to the idea of tribes or tribalism. I think it's a term that carries a lot of truth. It's an interesting way to imagine Native peoples generally. It's not like cosmopolitan in the sense of some unrooted elite with their pinky raised while swishing wine glasses, in New York City or Los Angeles. A lot of times when people think of cosmopolitan people, we think about high culture, know about opera, know about Renaissance art or something like that. But there's an old and I think a little outdated saying which goes back to the idea of tribes, that Indians walk in two worlds is their argument, the Indian world and the non-Indian world. But the truth is that cosmopolitan basically means worldliness, and it's linked to travel, which a lot of Native people do on a daily basis. Even with people that I know in southwest Oklahoma, they're beating the path always between Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico, traveling to Minnesota for conferences, Washington, D.C. They are all over the place. And this worldliness or cosmopolitan is also linked to an intelligence that's accrued through that kind of experience and their ability to navigate the world. But it also makes them savvy in relationships and dealing with people, because then they're able to sort of mediate and operate across cultural, political, or national borders too. And so really the one word to remember out of all that is the idea of Native people's worldliness. That's largely what I mean by cosmopolitanism. I mean, with my hip-hop, I've done some research on Afro-Indian intersections, which is becoming much more common now in Native studies than when I first started this. I also dealt with the traditional nature of Christianity for many tribes. My last article was actually about that whole idea of movement in the way that they put together their rhymes, talking about all the places that they have traveled or the places that they will travel and what they were going to accomplish in all those places. And so there's that worldliness and that hip-hop vision. But there's also a worldliness for the Apache prisoner work that I do, because the Apache prisoners ended up in southwest Oklahoma. And southwest Oklahoma is home to 9 separate tribes: the Kiowas, the Comanches, the Apaches, the Wichitas, Caddos, Delawares, the Cheyennes, and Arapahoes. That's a lot of different people. That's a lot of different languages.
Yeah, and probably a lot of different musical traditions, too.
Absolutely. And the Fort Sill Apaches The Apache prisoners of war, that's what they were known while they were still prisoners. They were known for their music. When you see their ceremonial, you do not forget their ceremonial. People knew their music, they loved their music, they attended their dances, and you can also tell the love that Southwest Oklahoma has for that culture in the fact that people constantly draw pictures of their fire dancers or their mountain spirit dancers. And so really what that's about is intertribal love. It's a small region, but there's a real worldliness to that place.
So let's return to your research that traces the Afro-Indian musical tradition. How does this intersection of African-American and Indian musical traditions underscore the multiracial, the multicultural, the multi-ethnic strands of popular music?
If we're dealing with popular music, you almost always have to go back to, for American popular knowledge, I guess we typically start with like blues and jazz. But if I'm to rewind the clock a little bit, you do have to begin with the Native American. And people have a hard time seeing a relationship, Native American, blues and jazz, Native American, blues and jazz. It's very difficult for people to comprehend. This is a conversation that I hear more people having now. I hope you'll hear it again. But an ethnomusicologist named George Herzog wrote an article on African-American influences on native musics in the American Southeast in 1920, 1930. I can't remember the exact date. But the thing is that the relationship between natives and African Americans in the American Southeast was largely based off the fact that one of the case points that people often talk about are the Seminoles of North Florida, who acted as a refuge for escaped slaves. And Herzog discusses the stomp dance, which was common for Seminole people, for Creek people, and this type of music's present all the way from Louisiana over to Florida up towards New York. But if you look at the proximity of those Creek Seminoles, especially in the American Southeast and proximity to the Mississippi Delta, it starts raising some bells. The standard gloss is that a lot of escaped slaves would often go into Spanish North Florida to live with this break-off group from the Creek, the Seminoles, and they were able to live there. But you also have to look at what their experience would have been like. They would have been a minority amongst a larger Indian population. And so you have to ask, which way does that influence go? Does it go from the minority to the majority or the majority to the minority? There's mixing, obviously, but we do have to start asking about what was that native imprint. The movie Rumble actually talks about that whole issue of the Southeast, but they also take it to New Orleans, where jazz initially kind of grew. I've done some work on the Central Plains and Central Plains jazz in the Central Plains territories that ran from North Texas to Oklahoma to Kansas City. And that's the same place that Charlie Parker built his chops. And Charlie Parker himself, I think, had a Choctaw mother. Lena Horne was proud of her indigenous heritage. I think Duke Ellington as well. Even Jimi Hendrix is said to have had Cherokee roots. And these all go back to that southeastern Cherokee, Creek, Seminole sort of practices of the stomp dance. And so when you start adding up those pieces, right now these are footnote to American history. But there are ways to make them the major theme in a much bigger book. Typically, I have to say that Euro-Americans became American through their encounter with Native Americans. But you also have to ask how African Americans became American through their encounters with Native Americans as well. And I think this is a much bigger question that people are asking and should ask going into the future.
Well, thank you, Chris, for spending some time with us on Voces, Críticas. I wanted to give you an opportunity to share any final comments.
Few people get the opportunity to experience Native America. My argument is to get out there and do it. There are lots of ways to do that. You can buy books, you can listen to music, you can attend powwows. There are lots of different ways to experience it. I say don't go and take cameras, don't take notepads or audio recorders, but go and listen more than you talk. Soak it up and let that kind of grow inside of you over a lifetime, because there is a lot to see and learn in Native America, and I regret that I feel like fewer and fewer people are actively doing that today.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, for coming on the show.
Thank you.